It is my pleasure to introduce Nick Brotherton, and I'm excited to hear the fruits of the theological project that he has been mulling over since his sophomore year. He came to my office literally the first few weeks of me beginning here at GC just to talk about theology, and I can assure you I do not get a lot of requests like that, but since then I've always enjoyed watching him think through so many twists, turns, and make unexpected connections between theology, philosophy, music. And it reminded me, like I said, this past Sunday at the award ceremony, it reminded me of some of my colleagues when I was a doctoral student in Berkeley. And certainly throughout the time when he was working on his thesis, I learned so much about certain philosophers and about extreme metal music. Now, to get everyone in the mood for Nick's presentation, it is appropriate, I think, to remind everyone that today in the church calendar is Maundy Thursday. And we are supposed to be in this space of pathos as we reflect on what's about to happen to Jesus. And so in that vein, it's appropriate to consider Friedrich Nietzsche's favorite quote from his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderer of all murderers? Well, Nick has an answer, and without further ado, I invite him to come forward to share with us about healing God through evil music.
Hello, everybody. So this thesis talks a lot about death, and I just wanted to take a second to state my respect for the topic of death in itself, and particularly what it means to the GC community at this time. This is a respectful piece of work which honors the weight of death. Healing God with evil music, religious violence, the mortality of God, and divine resurrection as a sacrament of the church. Before we begin, theology is an interpretive field. There aren't really answers. There are a lot of interpretations on interpretations. As such, it's important to know that this as well is an interpretation. In the good words of Reverend Robert Brewer, all theology is nonsense. So, if we're talking about healing God, we have to start from a place where God is wounded or suffering. In this thesis, I explore the death of God. Now, this thesis considers the death of God a compelling response to theodicy, the question of evil. If God is good, if God is all-powerful, and yet if evil or suffering exists, not all three statements can be true. And so the death of God is a sort of limitation on God's power so that it can be good in the face of evil. The death of God, as the thesis explores, is also revealed in the crucifixion of Christ, Maundy Thursday. We start with Philip Meinlander, who provides a metaphysical concept of divinity. He sees it as a unity of everything that is and ever has been prior to the existence of the universe. This unity made the conscious decision to no longer exist. And when it began that process of non-existence, reality was formed out of polarized fragments of the divine body. Meinlander's philosophy is not agreeable in many places, but for this basic concept, it fits very well with the work of this thesis. Now, another part of Meinlander's philosophy is that the disunification of the divine is the direct cause of the suffering that we experience in reality. In the thesis, I look at 4 historical periods where the church as an institution has committed horrible acts of violence. We talk about the Inquisition and the Crusades, which systematized anti-Semitism and exclusionary violence through the church. We talk about the transatlantic slave trade, where the enslavement of other people was justified because African people, in the words of church authorities, do not have souls. We talk about indigenous genocide, where Christian missionaries often characterize American natives and their cultural practices as demonic. And finally, we explore the Holocaust, which is the logical conclusion of anti-Semitism, which may be one of the church's oldest traditions. The church at the onset of the colonial era was conditioning others to see unbaptized strangers as belonging to the company of devils. This is the systematic demonization of the stranger or the other, old Christian tradition. So we have to engage with this notion of suffering, and these two theologians do a good job of that. Jürgen Moltmann and Gustavo Gutierrez. Gutierrez has a political interpretation of suffering. He says that God suffers primarily with the oppressed people of the world, and that human liberation, in other words, social revolution, is a good means to enact salvation by elevating the voices of oppressed and marginalized people. On the other hand, Jürgen Moltmann has a metaphysical approach where God suffers with all of humanity, and in fact, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ are revelatory of the nature of God. And so, while Moltmann makes the claim that God has not actually experienced death, his interpretation of that event as revelatory of God carries an implication that God must have experienced death. God's suffering in this thesis will be analyzed as a problem of choice versus necessity, whereas in the traditional theological discourse, the question was whether God can suffer at all. These contemporary theologians offer a compelling argument for why God does suffer. And if God suffers, is it a choice or a necessity? Choice implies that human suffering itself is a choice. In the model of Mindlander, if God made the decision to disunify without any imperative to do so, then human suffering is a kind of frivolous exercise with no justification. If God suffers by necessity, then God lives in full solidarity with the human condition, not only suffering with us in the pains of life, but in the ultimate pain of the loss of life. In order to justify this, we take a deeper look at metaphysical constructions of God, and this is defined in my thesis as God's processual and spiritual ontology. As a being, God is essentially becoming itself rather than being itself, and that'll make a little bit more sense soon. Our good friend Hegel, some of you know and love him. He has a great metaphor at the beginning of his phenomenology of spirit. He describes the spirit as saying, the bud disappears in the bursting forth of the blossom, and one might say that the former is refuted by the latter. Yet, at the same time, their fluid nature makes them moments of an organic unity in which they not only do not conflict, but in which each is as necessary as the other. He does two things here. First, he ties the spirit to immanent, material, worldly processes. It is a part of these processes. And second, he discusses the discernment of absolute truth as attainable by the reconciliation and collaboration of different perspectives. A more contemporary thinker named Hyodong Lee talks about the transcendent made immanent, and this is our justification for arguing for God's death. He has a Christian Neo-Confucian syncretic reading where he compares the spirit to the Neo-Confucian great ultimate. Both of these entities precede reality as an ontological unity, as in the case of Philip Mindlander, but they also proceed from reality as the context allows, in the case of Hegel. And so he's kind of a synthesis of these two different perspectives about God. Very compelling stuff. And if a transcendent being is made immanent, if it proceeds from reality only as we are able to install the infrastructure for it to express itself, then it is arguable that that transcendent being has entered a state comparable to death. Sally McFague in The Body of God offers an interpretation of the universe as God's body, radical immanence and incarnationalism. She says that God was not incarnate only in Jesus Christ, but in every aspect of reality. We all contain God stuff, as the theologians refer to it. She also talks about the Spirit as the agent of God, which I find compelling. A God who is separated into the paradox of the Trinity, three entities, one being. It's interesting that only one of them at this moment in time is agential, is capable of doing anything. So how do we heal God if you buy the argument that God is dead, which is better made in the thesis, I have to admit. How do you heal a dead God? One of the most important parts of this argument is the Christian doctrine of afterlife and resurrection. These beliefs affirm life after death. They're essential pieces of eschatology and Christology, and therefore most Christians will believe in them. And they justify a hope that one might have for God to heal or reunite with itself. In other words, to resurrect. So let's talk about some methods. One thing we talk about is an ethical response to religious violence. And we understand religious violence through our study of the history as a function of exclusion and assertion of the self. Therefore, the most ethical response I can imagine is to practice a radical theological inclusivity. This means elevating marginalized voices and perspectives, maybe giving them the spotlight. For my theology friends, social and literary apophasis. It's based around the dynamic of self versus other. Here's our handsome friend Hegel, by the way. In the history, as I've said, it becomes clear that exclusion motivates religious violence. And as such, when we harm or oppress other people who contain just as much God stuff as ourselves, we, in the process, harm and oppress God. So Hegel's blossoming flower depends on the self embracing the other. Sally McFague talks about an imperative that we have, particularly if we believe in God, and that is we have the knowledge and power to destroy ourselves and to help the process of the ongoing creation continue. And so we can talk about ethics all day, but if we refuse to practice those ethics, we run the risk of destroying not only parts of God's creation, but possibly creation in its entirety. McFague is concerned with ecological and environmental issues, climate change, rising sea levels, and this is not only an argument for the equitable treatment of other humans, but for the equitable treatment of the earth as another incarnation of God stuff. Catherine Keller takes it a little bit further. She has one of my favorite ideas. First, she reinforces the necessity of considering other people's and other ideas that are contradictory to the self. But she says that we have to go further and learn to love the archetypal and perpetual other. This is to say that self-consciousness necessitates other consciousness. And so insofar as we will always have a concept of self, we will always have an other that we are tempted to oppress, but who we must resist temptation and decide to love. She also talks about the Kabbalist concept of tikkun, which is put in very interesting language. She says it's the metaphysical mending or healing of divine separation, a concept which again has echoes in the thought of Mindlander, or Mindlander echoes the Kabbalist thought more appropriately. Another question the thesis has, also rooted in the study of Catherine Keller, is this one. Is the traditional relationship with God fair? You know, we conceive of God as a healer who can never be healed, a father who can never parent, and a savior who can never be saved. And if we hear this call to practice radical relational love to the other, the transcendent other, then God deserves some of that love and reconsideration as well. All of this is cool. You know, there's a lot of theory here, but it's wanting practical application. There's nothing particularly scientific about it, but my means of application is extreme metal music. I forgot about this slide. If the death of God is revelatory of if the death of Christ is revelatory of the death of God, the resurrection of Christ is revelatory of the resurrection of God. They come one with the other. So, as I said, my preferred means of expression for these theories is extreme metal music. Now, this music has been demonized by Christian cultural figures, not necessarily oppressed, but certainly repressed within the cultural mainstream. It's a theological source from the secular or pagan other, and it is only one example of numerous genres and styles of music within which we can read theology. In my thesis, we chart 3 points which can effectively guide a listener to understanding the philosophy present in heavy metal music. There's the early manifestation. Black Sabbath is the prime example. Earnest philosophical conversations about evil, war, politics, religion as well. Black Sabbath was a Christian band. If you don't believe me, check out Master of the Universe. Then there's the reactionary strain of heavy metal music. This came around the late 70s, early 80s. Venom, Dissection, Dragged into Sunlight. This was a response to demonization by Christian cultural figures, and that response consisted of the radical expression of not only controversial topics, but topics which were explicitly offensive to Christian sensibilities. And then finally, the main focus of this thesis is the progressive strain of philosophical thought in metal, characterized by all these bands, more even, and it is a progression of the original earnest engagement with philosophy, but influenced by the controversial and offensive mode of expression of that philosophy. It's very interesting, and I think the best band to demonstrate this progressive strain of philosophy and metal is Agalloch. You can call them a neo-pagan / folk / black metal band. Metal bands love their genre specifiers. And in their album Marrow of the Spirit, they contemplate the essence of the Spirit. What does it mean? From their perspective in the song Into the Painted Gray, they discuss a concept very identifiable with the death of God theology outlined here. Primarily a creator God who is trapped within the boundaries of its own creation. A few of the lyrics that are particularly relevant. For centuries, kingdoms have risen upon the ancient hands of a God, once severed for the world's birth. Forlorn in the cold Neolithic embrace, forsaken deep in the sullen tide, how long shall I suffer here? These reinforce and affirm some of the ideas my thesis covers. And there's another lyric burned into my mind, which I forgot to wrote, but they say in this song, I am not an ageless God, no, I am imprisoned by time. These ancient poems shall once again be mine. And it kind of emphasizes this prophetic notion of an eventual resurrection of divinity. All that being said, I would encourage you to engage with what your church says is demonic. Embrace evil a little bit, because maybe it's not as bad as some people say it is. And if you have any questions, now's the time. Yes.
So I have an applied question. Are you suggesting that next semester our chapel should consider Agalloch and Black Death and other similar genres of praise music?
Absolutely. I think that this music, when you approach it in the way that I have, can be seen as sacred music. I mean, when Agalloch, their vocalist, screams, how long shall I suffer here? It's not only that vocalist expressing himself, but it is almost a metaphysical union of these different artistic visions becoming one. And it sounds more like the voice of God than of a man.
My God, why have you forsaken?
Exactly.
Got it.
Yes.
Okay, so two different questions. Comment on the Sally McVeigh, is that it?
Yes.
and I don't know much about it because it's been a hot minute since I did my own grad stuff, but it's sounded a little like Gnosticism, that spark of God within you. I think that was a Gnostic belief that everyone had a divine spark within them. So that was something, I don't know if she was influenced by that at all. And then the other question is, well, the first one wasn't a question, but now the question is, I do not listen to that music. Why do they scream?
That, I love that question. First of all, I would encourage you to take a look at Agalloch. It's beautiful music, though a little rough. But they scream because, well, like theology, it's up for interpretation. As I understand it, particularly in the context of Agalloch, the scream is an abandonment of the traditional melodic voice. It is a means of vocal expression that brings the listener to a new place. Instead of being melodic, it's actually very percussive. And in that sense, it has different applications.
I would just like to comment on it because up until Nick started working on this, I would never go out of my way to listen to metal. But he's had me listen to several different pieces. And I've come to have a certain appreciation because you can hear within these different bands a variety of things. Some are very beautiful, as we would normally think beautiful, and then some are just very rough. But I think that overall you can see that they're trying to be expressive with their thought. And there's just a lot of different ways, and some are a little bit rougher than some of us are used to. But I've come to appreciate it based on the things he shared.
Another shameless plug for Agalloch.
There you go.
Yes, Aaron.
So first I want to say, great job, Nick. I've been Nick's guitar teacher here at college for the past couple of years. It's just a wonderful student. And I've heard a lot about this project, but I haven't had a chance to see it until now. So really great job. I might have two questions.
Okay.
The first question is, who or what is really qualified to put the label evil on music? What is the determining factor? Like, are there music critics sitting over at the Vatican right now, like just going through Spotify? Or did your research uncover into that?
Well, what my research suggests is that the attribution of evil to something is really more of a construct of church authority. So during the Inquisition, when Jewish people were accused of poisoning wells and the blood libel, of course, Christians may have seen Jewish people as evil. That was not necessarily because they're evil. In fact, I believe that Jewish people are not evil, but rather because the church characterized them in such a way for them to be received as evil. So it's much the same with music. This music is not evil, but it could be perceived as such. And it's just more provocative to put it that way.
And I guess the follow-up to that is it being perceived as evil because of the sonic qualities of it? Loud, aggressive sounding, screaming, things like that?
That's very possible. And when I chart the philosophical development of the music, there's a noted point around the same time that the ideas got more offensive, that the sound also got way more offensive. People recording the worst quality equipment they could, making the grossest, grimiest sounds they could. And I think that is also an important part of the expression of the genre. Yes.
So, much that is interesting here. But let me ask about, first of all, I don't think I'm not a metal fan either, right? But Panopticon, that is an awesome band.
It's an awesome band.
Yeah,
It's incredible.
yeah, that's I mean, already I know they're smart, right? So, but
Well, the person who runs the band is a one-man band. His name is Austin. He does bluegrass and black metal. It's fantastic, but I'm sorry to.
okay, all right, that's an interesting combo. So my question about the music though is, you know, I get the sense, and disabuse me of this if I'm wrong, right? But I get the sense, based on what you're talking about here, that the metal music expresses, enacts the pathos of the crucifixion and the death of God, right? It's like God with us in that regard, right? Is there a countervailing tendency in metal music that points to resurrection? Or does it just, I guess that's what I'm asking, does it just point, or is there, is there a moment when the heavenly choir starts to sing?
Well, it's not exactly a heavenly choir, but there is one band called Heritoire, and in their album, The Golden Circle, they have many songs that, though they are written with the abrasive production techniques of metal, and though they're written in the minor key, they feel elevating and they feel very optimistic and positive. There's no lyrical way that I could show it from their album, but it does speak to me in a sort of liminal way about resurrection.
Okay, yeah, I'm just interested, does the music do both, right?
I sure hope so.
Yeah.
Robert.
Yeah, it just seems like a lot of nonsense, and I like it a lot.
Write that down.
I mean, theology, the production of theology, that kind of thing. But I would say like resurrection doesn't have to sound like a heavenly choir.
Yeah.
Sometimes it sounds like somebody screaming into the darkness. And I feel like your thesis in a way has a lot more hope for humanity than it might seem, because you have this idea that maybe we can heal the divine by coming together, by bringing the unity of all things, by creating the kingdom here. There's a lot of sense of, oh, this is possible in this broken humanity that church that always suppressing each other. Do you see that? Or
Absolutely. It might be called idealistic in a diminutive way, but I do believe. Let's go back to Sally McFague's quote. We have the power to destroy ourselves and to keep going. And we've seen through history that we're very good at destroying ourselves. So, in a sense, I believe it because the research points to it. And in another sense, I believe it because I feel like it's sort of a last resort. Yes, Eric.
Yeah, did you come across any, what do I want to ask? The members of the band, of these bands, were they religion majors? Were they philosophy majors? Did they not study anything and just decided to do it? Did you come across any of that in your research?
I made many efforts to reach out and have conversations with these bands. Some of them, like one band called Falsa Brauros, got back to me initially, but then dropped contact. As far as Agalloch is concerned, one of their guitar player, Don Anderson, actually taught a course about metal music at a university up around New York. And he had a lot of very interesting insights about the cultural development of metal. But beyond that, a very secretive group, and it's been hard to make any kind of contact. So I'm adulterating their works with my interpretation. Yes, Polly.
I know we're getting close to time, but I've waited 2 days to ask you. I wanted to ask Nick this yesterday. He rehearsed with me and he said, no, wait, because I want to be surprised. It's not that deep. What is God stuff?
What is God stuff?
Yeah.
So it's
your interpretation.
Yeah, it's the idea that if God truly exists in everything, in reality, then everything in reality contains God stuff, some essence reminiscent of the God that we all come from. It's like stardust in a scientific sense, when they talk about how the Big Bang happened and everything is a consequence of that, we're all stardust. Likewise, if you're religious, we're all God stuff.
Okay.
Yes,
I've got another one for you. So I'm thinking Hegel here, okay, buddy. But
that's the one I
also-
read the least of.
Yeah, also some of the other things you were, kind of pointing toward God as a process theology sort of thing, but what I'm wondering is thinking maybe mostly of Hegel and what you're saying, overall. And this is where the question is coming from. For Hegel, it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There is a synthesis out there, but there's conflict along the way, right? And that's part of Geist, the spirit itself, right? But that also is reflected in history for Hegel, right? So, if the conflict and the death of God is a kind of necessity for God, right? Once the process has begun, right? Is that conflict also unavoidable for us?
The
Right.
conflict of death.
I would think more broadly, the conflict in history in general, right? People fighting against each other. One idea being posited, Hegel would say one idea being instantiated, right? And then another rising up against it, right? I'm thinking of our reading in class about tragedy, for Hegel, that's part of the tragic element, temporary perhaps, right? But the tragic element of life is that there is that conflict it must happen, right? In order to get to the synthesis
Well,
on the other end.
Well, this is why I like Hyodong Lee so much. In his synthesis of Hegel and Meinlander, he talks about God as the ontological basis. From a perspective of death and suffering, it might mean that God has experienced every death that has happened, every death that is capable of happening, and in such a way suffers to such a degree we couldn't imagine. But God proceeding from reality, as far as we construct a reality to allow, it is not necessary that all of those deaths happen. It is only necessary that God responds to our actions. And so through Hyodong Lee's characterization, I think it is not necessary for us to persecute people.
Yeah, not necessary.
No, it certainly happens.
Yeah.
That's something
Yeah.
I would not like to continue.
Right, well, that's what I was saying. Of course I was hoping you would say that, right? But I mean, one could go down that road and end up saying, yes, it's gonna happen, so why fight it, baby? Right?
I actually thought about that exact response in the car this morning. It terrified me. So I appreciate that. Yes.
More of a comment. I just hope that you continue with this idea and this work and share this with more people, because I agree. I think that it's actually a really optimistic and, hopeful way to move forward, I think, for everybody. And also maybe if you decide to kind of dive deeper into metal music and exploring, I think I mentioned Slayer to you before, and how, members of that band are religious, and they are, sure, a lot of metal music is just the performative, but I think a lot of it is rather holding a mirror up to the conflicts in society and the screamings, the aggression, and and I think that, and so I'd be curious to see that project kind of go forward. So
Absolutely.
great job.
Thank you. And so much in metal is just looking at the cruelty that these institutions of holiness and righteousness have committed, and rightfully criticizing those. So I hope to continue looking at it.
But does it lead to hearing loss?